My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and this is a series of videos on hermeneutics, the art and science of interpreting the Bible. And the current video will be a video on doing a Greek word study. Now, the general principle is that it's important as you're studying a passage to determine the meaning of key Hebrew and Greek words that lie behind the English terms in your passage. And we will do that with a Greek word in our current study. And the steps that you would have in a word study, if you did all the steps, are listed here. I won't go through them in detail. But you have to find your original word, its frequency, its distribution, its stock translation, compare translations, look for etymology and cognates, compare with the Septuagint, the early Greek translation, and try to study it through time and at the same time, and look for synonyms and secular usage and theological usage and the like. And as we mentioned in the last video, these steps, as important as they are only rarely carried out even by Bible scholars, because it does take a very long time. You could actually write a dissertation doing all these steps thoroughly on certain words. But doing them to some degree can be helpful for personal study. And so the word that I'm going to study as a Greek word is the word kephele, which is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. And quoting from the New American Standard Bible, Paul says, "I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ." And what is at issue here is the exact meaning, especially the metaphorical meaning of head in these passages. Now, obviously, man is not physically the head of the woman in the sense that she does have a biological head on top of her shoulders, but some sort of metaphorical sense in which Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. And there are several lines of interpretation that have been made of this verse. And it's become a controversial verse in recent years, especially with the rise of feminist and egalitarian type Christianity. Does this passage teach a hierarchy in which head means that you're an authority over, and that's the traditional view of the text? Or does it have the idea of source and origin, that the man is the source or origin of the woman, which many egalitarian Christians will defend? Or there's yet a third view that Thistleton proposed, and that head in various passages in these metaphorical usages means preeminent part. Now, if you take the authority over view, then there's a hierarchy, that God is the head of Christ and that God the Father is superior to Christ the Son. And then Christ is the head of man. Again, Christ is over mankind. But then man is the head of the woman or the wife. It could be husband and wife. Again, that can be taken and has often been taken traditionally as a hierarchical view. But then the egalitarian view argues that headship doesn't mean authority over, but that there's a different meaning of head in the sense of origin or source. And those that take this view see this as an allusion to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 22. And in the creation account, Eve was taken from Adam's side. And so man is the source or origin of the woman. And in turn, Christ finds his eternal origins from God the Father, and man finds his origin from Christ, who was involved in creation. And there's at least some support for this idea in the passage of 1 Corinthians 11 itself, because even though it talks about the man being the head or source or origin of the woman, but it says in verse 8 and verse 12, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. And as for woman, as woman came from man, so man is born of woman, and everything comes from God. And so the first woman came from man, from Adam. Eve came from Adam, but subsequently every man was born of woman. And anyway, this at least supports the idea that maybe source or origin might be the idea behind headship in this particular case, in which case it may have nothing to do with authority. And yet another view, Thesselson's view, is that it has to do with preeminent part. And as we look at that one, it comes somewhere in between the traditional view and the egalitarian view. And the discussion that I'll lay out in what follows will mostly concentrate on the traditional view and the egalitarian view, but there are other views that are out there that are at least have to be considered. Now, again, some of the steps you have to take, you need to find the Greek word, you find the frequency of it and where it's located, stock translations, and look at how translations differ, look at etymology, look at how the Hebrew word might be behind the Greek word in certain cases in the Septuagint, and how the word is used in various periods of the Greek language, and what is the metaphorical usage of this word in the New Testament. So that's the steps that you would want to go through, and we're going to start that. Now, the first thing that you have to do is to find your Greek word. And the traditional way, the old-fashioned way of doing that would be to take a tool called an exhaustive concordance, like Strong's exhaustive concordance, and you would find your word, in this case, head, in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, in the concordance, and it would have a number that would go back to a lexicon. And that lexicon would tell you what the Greek word behind the English word head is. And you could also find other passages where that particular Greek word is used in the New Testament, regardless of how it gets translated. Now, you can also do this by going online, and the steps would be this: to go to a website called BibleStudyTools.com. You would find an interlinear Bible on that website. You have a choice between King James Version and New American Standard Version. And then you would search on the interlinear Bible for 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. And from there, you could click on the English word head, and that would take you to the Greek word in the lexicon. Now, what I want to do is to try to show you how that would be done. And so here I'm going to Bible Study Tools. And what I would need to do is to go under the heading Bible, click on that menu. And here it would show interlinear Bible. So I'll click on that, and that'll take you to the interlinear Bible. And since the default is King James, I'm going to just use the default, which is King James. But then I could search for 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. So I'll find 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. And there's the interlinear Bible. So you have the English words, and then underneath it you have Greek words that correspond with the English words. The easiest thing, though, now is to click on the word head, which takes you to the entry for the King James lexicon. There is also a New American Standard New Testament Greek lexicon, but it's the default is King James, so that's what I'm using right now. And that's Strong's number 2776. And then it tells you the Greek word is the word kefale, and shows you what the Greek word looks like, tells you how to pronounce, transliterate and pronounce the word. And it also gives you a definition of the word from a dictionary sort of point of view, either literally head of both men and often animals, then metaphorically anything supreme, chief, or prominent, and of persons, of Christ, and of things. And then on the right, it tells you the books of the New Testament where that word is used and how many times, and you can click on that and actually go to where it's used. So if I go to 1 Corinthians, there you can see all the different verses that use the word kefale, which is translated normally head. So that's how it works, just in order to find your word. So again, you go to BibleStudyTools.com, find the Interlinear Bible, look up 1 Corinthians 11:3 in the Interlinear Bible, click on the word head, and that will take you to that lexicon and give you the entry. And once you've done that, you find that according to this entry, it is used some 75 times in the Greek New Testament. Now, we don't have time to look up all 75 usages, but we can narrow down our search by limiting ourselves just to places where head is used in a metaphorical way, not the literal head of an animal or a person, but a metaphorical use of headship or kefale. And if we do that, we only have a far more limited number of cases that need to be looked at. The figurative usages are these ones in Matthew 21 and verse 42, in our verse in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, in Ephesians chapter 1, chapter 4, and chapter 5, and in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 10 and verse 19. And so in a little bit, we will go back and look at those particular verses. But the first step we've done, we've found our word, we found distribution, and we have found frequency, particularly of kefale used in metaphorical senses. Well, the next thing that we might want to do is to compare translations. What's the stock translation? Well, most all translations almost always translate kefale as head, so that's not terribly helpful. But if you go to some of the Bible translations that are more paraphrastic, shall we say, these will often give you interpretive paraphrases. So the Good News translation, it translates verse 3, the husband is not head, but supreme over his wife. That's clearly the traditional interpretation. Also, a Lutheran translation, God's Word, translates it, a husband has authority over his wife. Again, that's the traditional understanding. When you move to the 1996 online version of the New Living Translation, it rendered the verse, a woman is responsible to her husband. And this kind of looks like the traditional view, but it seems to have softened it to instead of being subject to being responsible to in some sense. But it kind of looks in the direction of the traditional rendering. Though it's interesting that in the NIV online 2003, it was revised to the literal rendering that the husband is the head of, or the head of the woman is man. So it ends up going back to the most common rendering head. But then in the margin, it gives two interpretations of that. One is that the source of woman is man, and that's the egalitarian view. But then alternatively, a woman is responsible to her husband, going back to that 1996 paraphrase. So that tells you that even some of the translations that are out there disagree on exactly how to interpret this verse. Then we get to etymology and early figurative usage of kephale in classical Greek. Now, the basic meaning in classical Greek is, as in the New Testament, the physical head of some sort of animal or human. But there are some figurative usages, and the one that has come into play most in classical Greek, again, classical Greek would be Greek of from around 300 BC and before. People like Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides and Herodotus, that's classical Greek. But anyway, figurative usage in classical Greek, one that's pointed to is usage some 3 different times for kephale, standing for the source or origin of rivers. And it's from this particular observation that the idea has come that, well, maybe what kephale means in 1 Corinthians 11:3 is not authority over, but source or origin of. And so that's a very important observation there. Moreover, it's interesting to note that in classical Greek, there are a number of figurative usages that are attested in the standard classical Greek dictionary, which is Little and Scott, but it does not list kephale as being used in the sense of authority over in any of those metaphorical usages. Never does it have the sense of superior rank or authority over. And Berkeley and Abel Michelson, who wrote a book on hermeneutics, mentioned this in their hermeneutical textbook. It says, for Greek-speaking people in New Testament times who had little opportunity to read the Greek translation of the Old Testament, there were many possible meanings for head, but supreme over or being responsible to was not one of them. And the Michelsons, in turn, prefer the meaning source or origin that they find in that 3 texts in classical Greek that's used with regard to rivers. Now, on the other hand, there is a cognate that is of some significance, kephalios, which means head-like, but it's used figuratively of persons in the sense of head or chief person. And so even though that's not the word kephale, it's a cognate of kephale in classical Greek, nonetheless, there is a cognate that does have that more authority over sense. So it's not totally without basis in classical Greek that at least a cognate of kephale, kephalios, can be used in a sense more along the lines of the traditional interpretation in 1 Corinthians 11:3. Now, the next thing that one does is consult with the Septuagint. For the early Christian church, the Septuagint, for a large number of the Gentile-speaking Christians, was their Old Testament. In fact, many Jews knew Greek better than Hebrew, and it would be their Old Testament as well. And in the Septuagint, kefale is used sometimes in the sense of authority. As a matter of fact, there are a number of cases in Judges 10 and 18, Judges 11:8, Judges 11:9, Judges 11:11, 2 Samuel 22:44, Psalm 18 verse 43, and Isaiah 7 verses 8 and 9, where kefale does seem to have the idea of an authority figure. For example, Judges 10 and verse 18, whoever will launch the attack against the Ammonites will be the head of all those living in Gilead. And head seems to have the idea of leader, of authority. Or in 2 Samuel 22 and verse 44, and David is speaking, David says, "You have delivered me from the attacks of my people. You have preserved me as head of nations." And David was head of nations in the sense that he was the king over them. Head is a term for an authority figure here. People I did not know are subject to me. That confirms that head has to do with being in authority over, so that other people are subject. Now, if we go back to that quote by Berkeley and Elvira Mickelson, they make the comment, for Greek-speaking people in New Testament times who had little opportunity to read the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He raises the question, why do they mention that? Because they know that in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, kefale is used at least 8 or 9 times in the sense of an authority over. And so they wanted to downplay that in order to support the other interpretation better. A little bit further discussion. We should mention that the Septuagint, rather than Classical Greek, is a better source for New Testament word meanings. That's for 2 reasons. One is that the Septuagint is broadly Hellenistic period Greek. Classical Greek is the period before Hellenistic Greek. And just by being closer to New Testament times makes it a better source for determining meaning, since words do change their meanings over time, and a word that was true, meant something in Classical Greek, might not mean that by Hellenistic times. But more importantly, the Septuagint was the Greek Old Testament for the early church. And for a large number of Christians, that was their Old Testament translation. And so they would know the Septuagint rather well. And oftentimes New Testament words are used in the light of Septuagint Old Testament usages. And so just in general, Septuagint would be a better source for meaning than Classical Greek. Another thing to point out in this regard is that Wayne Grudem had a counter argument for the use of kefale for rivers, meaning source or origins of rivers. He argues that what it means is not source or origin in the English sense of that, but a head is actually an extreme part of a river. So it's at the extreme end of a river. We call that the source or origin of the river, but there they call it the head of the river. You might call it the headwaters of the river. He also points out that, interestingly, that kefale is also used of the mouth of the river. And that's where he gets the idea, well, what it really means is extreme ends. So whether it's one end of the river or the other end of the river as it empties into some larger body of water, any one of those ends can be called a kefale. And of course, you show the absurdity of the argument source or origin If you point out that kefale is used of the mouth of the woman, does that mean that 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3 means that the husband is the mouth of the wife? Again, that would be an illegitimate thing to do, but then equally source or origin in this particular usage may not mean source or origin in the sense of something that comes from something else, but simply the extreme ends of things, and therefore may not be relevant to the discussion at all. Moreover, Grudem argues that there is some evidence of Hellenistic Greek using kefale as a term for authority. That is used of Philo of Alexandria, writing in Hellenistic Greek, occasionally uses kefale in the sense of authority. And the early church fathers often use kefale in the sense of authority over, as all biblical and linguistic scholars admit. Well, ultimately, your decision is going to hinge on usage in the New Testament. Again, that's the most important place to find meanings of words, is in the synchronic period, the same time period, and that would be the New Testament itself. Now, if you look at a standard lexicon of the New Testament, the Bear Arndt Gingrich Danker Greek English lexicon, it gives two basic definitions: the literal head of a man or a beast, and then figurative heads. And in that category, it has superior rank, which corresponds with the traditional interpretation. And it also gives uppermost part, extremity, endpoint, a meaning that relates to what Grudem pointed out in classical Greek of rivers. But anyway, uppermost part, extremity, or endpoint is that's the definitions that BAGD gives for the word kefale. And so what we want to do is to look at each one by one. So in Matthew 21, verse 42, Jesus said to them, "Did you ever read the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected, this has become the kefale stone, or the chief cornerstone." A headstone, if you think of the three interpretations that we have, the headstone is certainly a prominent part. It's the starting point for future building. It's the headstone. But I'm not sure that this really relates very much to our discussion among people as to headship. So it's a metaphorical usage, but I can't tell that it really assists us that much. The next one is in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 22. And he put all things in subjection under his, referring to Christ's feet. God the Father put all things under Christ's feet and made him, Christ, head over all things to the church. And this idea of being put in subjection under his feet makes it sound like headship has to do with being of superior status, and being subject would be of inferior status. So this seems on the face of it to imply something about authority over. If we move to Ephesians 4 and verse 15, it says, "But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in him in all respects to him who is the head, that is Christ." And that passage in 4:15 is talking about Christ being head in the sense of we are to grow up to Christ as head, and so that could be understood as Christ is the source or origin of the church or the body, which is Christ. but it could also imply, certainly it means he's a source of life and growth. If you cut off the head of something, it dies. It certainly fits the idea of prominent part. Head is prominent as compared with the rest of the body. But given the usage in Ephesians 1:22, you can't rule out that there may be an underlying idea of authority as well. If we move on to Ephesians 5:23 through 25, there it says, "For the husband is the head of his wife, as Christ also is head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. And husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her." Here, the husband's headship with regard to his wife is compared with Christ's headship over the church. And Christ's headship over the church implies authority, as we saw back in Ephesians 1:22. And it's suggested here that the husband as head is to have authority over his wife, just as it says, just as the church is subject to Christ, so wives ought to be to their own husbands. And so it sounds like headship implies a certain amount of submission to authority in this particular context. Now, this goes on to balance authority out with the example of Christ's loving self-sacrifice, that husbands are to love their wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. And so Ephesians 5:23 through 25 doesn't encourage men to be tyrants or to force women into submission. It's the duty to, but it does seem to imply that it's his duty to exercise leadership in marriage towards the end of caring for his wife, even if that requires the ultimate self-sacrifice. In marriage, care subordination implies that the husband leads the family for the benefit of the wife, not just for his own selfish pleasures. And the wife is to be subject to her husband for the sake of family unity and stability. But it kind of looks like head here, it does have some idea of authority over. Colossians 2, verses 10 and also verse 19. There it says, and in him you have been made complete, and he is the head over every ruler and authority. And then skipping to verse 19, and not holding firmly to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. Now, here is referring to Christ in both verses, Christ being head over every ruler and authority, some translations, principalities and powers. And that clearly implies authority over them, just as the parallel passage in Ephesians 1:22 says. And then Colossians 2:19 echoes Ephesians 4, talking about being the head from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. So that would be parallel to that. It can be a source of life and growth. And again, can't rule out authority given that it's in the context. Now, another consideration that's thrown into this discussion is a theological one. One author, Gilbert Bilezikian, wrote an article in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, Hermeneutical Bungee Jumping Subordination in the Godhead, where he argues this way. He argues that Christ cannot be co-equal with the Father if he is subordinate to him. In that statement, God is the head of Christ. If it implies that he is subordinate to God, then he is not co-equal with God the Father. He would be an inferior being. just as the wife cannot be equal to her husband unless the marriage is egalitarian. Thus, the source or origin interpretation is a better interpretation to maintain the doctrine that Christ is co-equal with the Father. In other words, what it means that God is the head of Christ means that Christ finds his eternal being in the Father. And in that sense only, God, the Father, is the head of Christ. And so he makes a systematic theology argument in favor of the egalitarian interpretation. But then two other authors, Stephen Kovac and Peter Schimm, wrote a rebuttal article, a defense of the doctrine of the eternal subordination of the Son, and also in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. And they argue that one must distinguish between functional or economic subordination in the Trinity and subordination of substance or essence. Functional subordination has historically been taught by the church theologians, while essential subordination is the Arian heresy. Arian that said that Christ was only a created being, the archangel Michael. The Arian view of subordination says that Christ was subordinate in essence and worth, which undermines the divinity of Christ. But functional economic subordination is orthodox and arguably the biblical view, whereas the essential subordination is the only type of subordination that needs to be condemned. Again, the idea of functional subordination, all human beings are equal in the sense that all human beings are made in the image of God, but there's a functional difference between a general in an army and a private in the army. So there's an essential equality in terms of image of God, but a functional inequality in terms of function within the particular task of the military. Well, what are we to conclude about all this? My own conclusion is that I find Grudem arguments for kephale having connotations of authority in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3 a bit more convincing than the egalitarian view that it means merely source or origin. But clearly the matter is complex and there are possible mediating interpretations. The goal here is merely to present both sides fairly, not so much to convince you of a particular viewpoint, and to emphasize the methodology involved in doing a word study. What's important to know is that the main purpose of the discussion is to show the method and importance that word studies play in the theological exegesis of the New Testament. And if you were to do a study of your own on kephale, you would want to look up those scholarly articles on kephale from both the traditional side and the egalitarian side, and perhaps others that have been published since I did my own research. So that's an introduction to Greek word studies using the example of kephale. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.